All right, so let's get started. So, hi everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us for today's webinar. I hope that wherever you are in the world, you're having a great day so far. My name is Jason Yen, and I'm the head of solutions here at Conscia. I'm joined by my colleagues, Dwayne Remeke, Conscia's co-founder and our CTO, and our principal architect, Oasis Valley. So in the past, we've showcased a series of webinars talking about how Conscia empowers business users to manage and experiment with dynamic experiences on various channels. Many of you have seen the omni-channel showcase, which is what we're showing here, where we showed you how you can orchestrate experiences using commerce tools, Cloudinary, and Content Stack as the systems of record. Now, on LinkedIn, many of you have been following our co-founder and CEO, Sana Remeke, and one of the things you've asked for is a technical deep dive of Conscia. And so today, that's exactly what we'll get into. If this is the first time you're joining one of our webinars, Conscia is a digital experience orchestration platform, or DXO, that empowers business and marketing teams to orchestrate dynamic experiences in a composable stack. In terms of where we sit in the composable stack, it is right here. And let me just jump here. Okay. So where we sit in the composable stack is right here in the middle. Now, some of you may have seen this picture before, and I'll kind of break it down for you. At the bottom here, we have the data, such as the CMSs, the DAMs, the CDPs, etc. Now, at the top portion of this diagram, we have the various front ends, such as mobile, desktop, Internet of Things. Now, the middle tier is the decisioning tier. And we believe it's important to separate real-time decisioning from both the data and the delivery layers. This decisioning layer needs to be managed by business users. And this is because business teams need to be able to control who should see what experience, when, and where. Now, IT, on the other hand, also gets involved because the decisioning layer also connects to all of the backend sources of data and content via the APIs. These APIs need to be orchestrated in a variety of ways to create bespoke experiences for your customers. So just to kind of summarize what I just mentioned and kind of this diagram, we believe that a successful orchestration platform enables collaboration between both business and IT teams. As such, the focus of today's webinar will be on the IT stakeholders. And for that, I will hand it over to Dwayne.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? We're good? All right, good stuff. All right, so I'm going to start off with the big question. What do we mean when we say the word orchestration? So this can sometimes be turned into a religious debate, which we're not here to do. Orchestration to us, we'll just define that and then we'll move on, knowing that this is what we mean when we say the word orchestration. The word orchestration has been referred to as many things. It could be glue code. It's been termed as middleware, API stitching, choreography, all of those things. So we're just going to put a picture in place, what you're seeing on your screen right now, and discuss to you, well, let you know what we mean when we say orchestration. So on this screen, we'll show a very simple and very typical example of what orchestration means. So we're going to be calling our engine, and we're going to do some orchestration. So what does that mean? So let's say we have a front end that knows something about a user, right? We know its user ID. So if you look on the right-hand side here, what we're saying is that someone's going to pass in a customer ID. And what we want to orchestrate is the following. We want to take that customer ID. We want to call a system like a CDP, like segment, get the customer type. All right, so we have now the customer segment of the customer ID that was just passed in. And from that point, we also then want to take, fetch something from our commerce tools engine and merge the responses between what came back from segment and what came back from, in this example, commerce tools. All right, now based on the customer type, we can now go to our promotions engine because now we know who or what segment this customer belongs to, and then go to something like a talent one, as an example on the left-hand side here. This is our promotion engine that we're going to use, and we're going to say, hey, well, this customer ID that was passed in is of the segment X. So therefore, what promotions should I be showing this customer? All right, we get that response, and then now we might know more information about what we have to show, and furthermore can also feed into something that's going to call a CMS, in this example, content stack, to get in something that's more personalized for this customer. We know that since this customer in this example comes from is of type customer segment X, that we should be fetching specific banners, something personalized, something that is very specific to that customer type. Maybe then we want to take the output of what we got back from a promotions engine and from a CMS and merge that content together. All right. So these are all things that we mean when we say orchestration. We are going to call various backend services. We are going to then potentially aggregate the output of some or all of those backend services. We are then going to potentially, depending on the output of one of the backend services, we may or may not choose to execute or fetch more data from another backend service, right? We have to check conditions. We have to check if the response from backend services are even valid. We may choose to even want to log an entry in a database or some other system, right? And then we take that response and return that to the caller. All of that stuff that happens in the middle that I just described are examples of what we call orchestration. So in this webinar, what we're going to do is get into a little bit of the details of how the Conscia DX engine does all of those things in very kind of in a zero code, very low code, if at all, manner, right? We will be listening to your questions as we go through, and we have someone kind of logging those questions, so we will get into the details of those questions and make sure that we get everything you ask for responded to immediately. So let's go to the next slide here. All right, so the problem that we're solving. All right, so what happens now? So obviously orchestration, glue code, middleware, choreography, this is something that we all do today. All right, so whatever the term is that you want to call this is something that we all have to do now, right? So what we find the majority of the time is that a lot of that logic, unfortunately, is implemented in code that gets forgotten about. But what happens is that a lot of times that logic is actually tied very closely to the customer touch point, the web page, the kiosk, the what is coded, right? And so what you see on the screen here is an example of what that would be. So, here's all this glue code that we've written into our web app, into our web page, what have you, right? And it's making calls to the various backends. And then maybe it's as simple as, dragging and dropping some components or UI elements on a screen. And each of these UI elements are rendering some data coming back from various systems. That's as simple as it gets. And I wouldn't call that orchestration. It's called more of a point-to-point integration. However, there are times then when you're going to have to code something a little bit fancier, right? So you're going to have to take the output of one component and then do some coding and inject it into the response of another backend service, right? And the point here is that all of this is happening on, within code and typically tied very closely to one of your channels. Okay, there are times as well where folks are actually starting to put this kind of logic even into the backend. But the issue with that is that now it's tied to a backend, and the point of choreography or orchestration is to be orchestrating across all of your backends and to make it available to all of your front ends. So if we kind of summarize what I'm saying here, you get tight coupling between the front end and the back end, right? You have code that's calling, the front end is calling directly to the back end. A lot of times you're the one doing that coding. So now you have the infrastructure to maintain yourself. That obviously takes time, it takes money, it takes resources. It's a bunch of work. And with a bunch of work comes, you need to maintain this yourself, right? And one of the big issues with this is how do you get business users to start to inject their business knowledge into this orchestration, right? We will get into the details of that particular point a lot more as well. So let's talk about what we do here at Conscia, right? We basically wrapped up this orchestration engine into its own composable service, right? So we're really, really adopting that kind of composable architecture, right? You have front ends and UIs that do what they do best. Let them do that. You have back ends that are best of breed. Let them do what they do best. And what we've done here is offer orchestration as a service. Because it's a service, right? There is no custom code. There's zero configurations. And what you'll see shortly, Jason will show you a bit of a demo as to what that business UI will look like, if required, right? Because there's many times with the orchestration, you might not need a business user input for any of these choreographies or orchestrations that occur, right? So this is really what we're going to come back to this picture quite a few times to talk about the way that our engine works. This is what we've wrapped up here in the gray box in the middle that talks about the Conscia DX engine and what it does. So I'll walk you through a bit of an example as to what this all means. So coming in from the right-hand side, these are basically the clients. These are the things, the channels, the touch points, your customer touch points that are going to actually, what happened here? Can you guys see the screen okay?
It's a bit blacked out, Dwayne.
Yeah, I'm seeing that here. Are we good now?
Yeah.
All right. Great.
And
good stuff.
As you go through this and as you go through your next diagram, there's been a couple of questions around, I think, like latency. So if you're making a number of calls to APIs, does that kind of slow down your system? So if you can kind of address that as you go, that would be great. And thanks to the folks who submitted their questions so far. All
right. We've got a lot of questions already. That's a good thing. Okay, great. Great stuff. Okay, so I'm going to walk through this example and I will touch on those as I go. Thanks for the update, Jason. So the call is being made from on the right-hand side from some channel, from some touch point, whether it's a web app, a mobile app, a kiosk, some other backend service that you need to orchestrate, then that's coming in on the right-hand side. When you make that call to our engine, you provide what we call context. And context is, what do you know so far? What is the ID of the customer that you know of so far? And you're basically providing the engine with information that it's going to need to go and choreograph a bunch of calls to some backend services. When you configure the DX engine, what you're doing is configuring what we call components. These are not UI components, right? These are components that do basically one of a couple different things. The most common one is that it's going to make a call to a backend service. So in this diagram here, what we're showing is that you'll see that some of the components here have a logo. For this diagram, what we mean by that is this is a particular component that's going to make a call to that backend service. This component here on the top left is going to make a call to segment, right? So you've gone in and you've configured a component to go make a call to segment. You've gone in as well and maybe configured another component to go make a call to content stack and another one to commerce tool, right? You'll notice as well that each of the components has this green circle. And what we mean by that green circle is that this is context. All of these components that you configure, and you configure them individually, have access to the context that was provided when you make that call. Okay, that's key. And you'll see as well that the orange circle means that some of these components, whenever there's an orange circle, what we mean by that is that you have the option of basically using the rules engine. You can provide rules in that component. And what the rules are things like, when I make a call to content stack, I want, I've configured that component to go fetch a set of record IDs from a certain content type, right? But maybe you want rules to say things like, well, during certain times of the day, I will want to select the specific record IDs. Or depending on the context that was passed in, I might know something about the caller's location, right? So that would be a piece of context that you pass in, the location. If they're coming from Toronto, please select these specific record IDs from content stack. If they're coming from some other part of the world, please use, please select these other configurations. So understand that business rules are where you get to configure, you get to pass in different configurations for the components depending on context or depending on rules that you, a developer, or you, the business user, might want to specify at a component level, right? So that is optional. That's why you only see some orange circles, which we call business rules, in some of these components. All right. Now, all components have some kind of a configuration. Again, in the example of content stack, I mean, we're going to have to give it a token, and what the endpoint is. What's the content type I'm going to be querying? What are the record IDs I want to fetch back? Maybe it's a component that actually doesn't fetch specific content IDs or records from content stack. Maybe it's maybe you're just passing a filter, right? And then again, you would configure that filter, and we have a whole vast array of components which we won't get into right now. That's a whole other webinar right there. Next in line is these many arrows that you see. So when you configure content stack, let's talk a little bit about what this dependency between this component that's calling content stack is versus the component that's calling segment. So the fact that you can actually refer to the output of another component is what automatically sets up dependencies between components within the DX engine. This example here could be as follows. I've set up a call to content stack. However, I first need to know what the customer type or the customer segment is. So this kind of follows along with the example that was shown on my first slide, right? We'll get into the details as to how you specify that shortly in a deeper dive. We'll actually look at some JSON and see how that works. But just know this: all of the configurations for every component can either be hard-coded, like you put the value directly into the configuration yourself, like you might know what the specific record IDs are, or they might come, and mostly it does do this, it comes at query time, where you actually say, depending on the context that's been passed in, and or depending on the output of another component or other sets of components, do something different. Okay, so now you're basically starting to see how you can arrange these Lego blocks to form a flow of logic and choreography and orchestration. That's what the engine does. To touch very quickly on the question that was asked about speed. So a lot of the work is really done by the backend systems when it's called, right? So we do the orchestration, we make the various calls to the backend, and the backend may or may not be slow, or they may be very fast, right? And so each component at a component level gives you the option of doing some caching with the time to live, and we'll get into the details of caching shortly. But we've done a lot of benchmarks as far as how much extra traffic or load or latency does the engine itself add by evaluating all these rules, potentially if you have many rules or all of these components. And the most complex one that we did, I think, had about 20 or 25 different components, most of them calling various systems with dependencies amongst themselves. And it added 5 to 6 milliseconds. All right. So we've done an enormous amount of work making sure that we hold on to enough state. And really, that's really where the magic IP is to make the orchestration logic extremely fast. Obviously, we can't do anything about the latency added of making a call to a backend service, but that's why we add caching, so we can get a call that might have been 200 milliseconds to a backend service, down to 1, because now we have it cached. Okay. We'll get into all the details of what the connections are. So if a component needs to call a backend service, then it needs to know how to connect to that backend service within our engine. A connection is a separate managed thing where you say for segment, you need to know your API token and I think some other management key. Right, so those things are abstracted away. You set up your connections, and then you set up your components that may or may not use one of those connections. One last thing, very specifically, when we, this is happening again, isn't it? Bear with me 1 second here, guys. I'm having technical difficulties. All right, here we are. Got it. So some of these components, again, don't call backend systems. There's a lot of orchestration that happens when you're not calling a backend system, but you need to do something based on the output of another component, right? So many times you're going to want to aggregate the output of one or more components of, that might be called a backend service. And many times you're going to want to use some other components to evaluate what you should do next, right? So what I'm doing here is, and I don't know why this is doing this. Jason, are you still seeing that?
Yeah.
It automatically keeps progressing to the next page. I'll keep going on. We're basically outlining all the various approaches or the typical activities that happen in any orchestration use case, right? So we've done a lot of work in identifying 90-95% of all the common patterns that any orchestration problem has. And finally, anything that you would need custom logic for, because obviously no one engine is going to be able to handle every possible scenario. We have the concept of webhooks, right? And we'll get into the details of that again toward the end of this webinar, but you can then choose to write maybe a serverless function, some function that executes your custom code that is accessible via a web service, and use that to tailor the way that the engine works. So this is very, very powerful now. Like, if you need to intercept the data that is coming out of a particular component because it called a specific backend, and you want to do something with that before our component does something with that, then you have the ability to do so. So we have many different hooks within the life cycle of one request, from when the call gets made and when all of the work is done within the engine before it gets returned back to the caller. You have various points within that whole life cycle to actually hook in your own custom logic. And hopefully that answers a lot of your points. Jason,
just to add on to that,
yes.
Point about performance, one other advantage that the DX engine, Conscia's DX engine gives you out of the box is that it's smart enough to optimize the entire orchestration flow and parallelize the components that can be parallelized. So you get that out of the box. There's no configuration to be done for that. The DX engine is smart enough to figure out the components that it can parallelize, and hence even make backend system calls in parallel to basically optimize the flow as much as possible.
Good point. And I see the question about the caching and invalidation. Absolutely, you can invalidate the cache at any point. So there's an API endpoint that allows you to pick the component that you choose to want to invalidate the cache for. So we'll get into the details of that a little bit more as to the kinds of controls you do have within the cache, like time to live and all that stuff, fun stuff. But short answer, yes, we can invalidate at any time. I think that's all the questions for now. Okay, Jason, I'm going to return it back to you to actually show them a little bit of this UI, and I'll jump back in to talk about the details.
Yeah, okay. So we'll just take a couple of minutes just to walk you through the UI, just so that you have a sense of how we enable business user control. Dwayne had spoken a lot about connections, components, and experience rules, and I'll basically just show you a quick overview of it just so that you have a sense of what it is in mind. So the page that we're on right now is basically the connection screen. And obviously with the connection screen, this is where you create a connection to each of your composable backend systems. So in this case, we're going to be showing you just a very simple demo after this, where we connect to Segment, we're connecting to Cognary, and we're connecting to Content Stack. And so here what you do is, this is kind of a one-time thing where you basically create that connection, and then that connection is made available to other components. And so here what I'm doing is I can basically pick from a series of different connectors that we have built in out of the box. And once I pick that connector, that all of the connection setup elements are automatically not populated, but the right set of fields are automatically displayed that allow you to build that connection that you have in mind. So in this case, because I'm connecting to segment, because I want to get some information about the customer's profile, I obviously have to put in my endpoint, the token, and which space I'm dealing with. Okay. Now, once that connection has been made, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a component that connects to it, or that leverages it. And in this case, I'll just focus on segment here. You can see that we've created a component that is connecting with segment, and we're going to use that to get traits from segment. Okay. And so if I just kind of look at this guy here, this is basically where I can select which component type, and that's obviously going to use the connection that I had just created. And what I'm doing here is this is where I'm actually binding information that's coming from segment to the context. So we had talked a lot about personalization and how we trigger personalization using a customer's context. And context could be anything, right? It could be the type of audience you're part of. It could be a location. It could be time of day. It could be what part of the site you came from, what device. Those are all context.
Right. And just a real quick point here. Now, guys, this UI is something that that IT would be setting up. Okay, so when we talk about, we have the UI and the ability for business users to actually make their changes, right? We'll get to that. That's via rules. But the actual setup of the components, which is what Jason is showing here, this is not obviously something that the business user would set up. This is a tech IT job that gets set up upfront to set up what the orchestration is going to look like. And then later on, should you want the business users to inject some of their own rules and logic into a component, then that's for them. Okay, but this screen here, just to make the point that this is obviously very techy.
Yeah, that's a good point. And now, once I have all of my components created, what I can do is I can assign them to templates. Okay, and you can see that this particular component is part of a template that we created just for this this session. And so here, I'm going to switch to the experience rules. And the experience rules is essentially where the business user starts to do all the work, right? The two screens I showed you before were for the technologist. Here's where the business users can start to set up that personalization. Now, within the system, we have channels, templates, and components. And so what you can do here is each of the components that we've created, you can assign them to multiple templates, and templates can belong to one or more channels. And in that way, if I wanted to do something like featured headlines coming from Content Stack, and I wanted to use that on my web experience and my kiosk and maybe a mobile app, this is where I can reuse that same component across different templates, across different channels to ensure that customers have that consistent experience across all of the different touch points.
And as far as the term template, one thing to be very clear on is that a template is nothing more than a list of components. Okay, so some of you might be listening and hearing the word template and thinking that this is a UI construct. It's not. In our world, in the orchestration world, a template is really just a list of one or more components that you choose to say, hey, DX Engine, I need you to run this set of components for me and return whatever the responses are. But instead of always having to specify which components to run, you would just specify a template or component grouping within the query.
Yeah.
Over to you.
And I'll just quickly show you the nature of an experience rule, just so you have an understanding of how it works. So don't worry about kind of the stuff at the top. The two things I want to highlight here are the trigger condition and the target experience. Okay. And so the trigger condition is essentially what activates this personalization rule, this experience rule. And obviously it could be activated during a specific time-based campaign. You can also activate it based on real-time context. So in this case, I'm looking at a customer segment equals millennial. If that scenario is true, this rule will activate. And so here, what I can do is I can go and change that context to go look at any number of different things I know about the customer, or any other combination of things I want to do by kind of dragging and dropping different elements of this. So for this case, I mean, we've just done a very simple one where we're looking at a customer segment. Now, the target experience here, we are connecting to content stack, and here we're pulling back a curated set of records. The experience differs depending on the type of component you pick. In this case, we picked kind of a curated list. You can pick a dynamic list that basically generates a list of results based on the criteria that you put forth. Okay, now because this is kind of a tech-focused discussion, everything that I just showed you, because Conscia is API first, is available through the API. Okay, and what we can do is we can circulate this link just offline. But essentially here, what you have the ability to do is you can query the DX engine using a template code, or if you want to just look at the results from like a particular component, you can do that as well. Okay, so you can do it by template code or by component. Okay, now in terms of the next example that we want to show you, this is where we are talking about managing dependencies. Okay, and here what we're going to do is we want to make a call from one of our various channels, and we basically want to go and get relevant articles from content stack and relevant content in the term of a digital asset management system from Cloudinary. Now, what I want to do is I want to return personalized content based on what I know of the customer. And for that, what I want to do is first I want to make a call out to Segment to go get the customer's profile and go get the traits, and use those traits as part of my context to then drive experience rules. Okay, so if I go and if I hit this this page, I'm going to see something different than Oasis. Now, in terms of the workflow, what's going to happen here is you simply make an API request. And that API request could be something very simple, such as passing in the code of the component. In this case, we're passing in the content stack and the Cloudinary one. And the other thing I'm doing is I'm passing the customer ID, right? That's it, right? That's the entire request right there. So it's very simple from a front-end point of view. You're simply just saying, this is what I want returned, either a template or a component, and this is the context that I'm passing to you. Now, what's happening here is before it can go get the relevant articles or videos from content stack and Cloudinary respectively, it knows that there's a dependency, and it makes a call out to Segment first to get that customer profile. And once it gets that customer profile, it uses the traits within that as the context to then activate the appropriate rules within the DX engine. Okay, and if I just jump back here, we had showed you that, right? So here we're looking at, if you go back to the featured headlines, if we look at the millennials, what's happening is it's going and getting the traits from Segment. If that trait happens to be a customer segment equals millennial, I'm going to return these set of records. And I'll show you what that looks like on the front end. So here's just a very simple front end that we just mocked up. And here in the top right-hand corner, you can see that we have no context being passed. And so what happens is a default set of experience rules basically kicks in. Now, when we want to personalize something, what we're doing is we're passing in that the segment customer ID, and it's going and making, it's using that context, making the call to Segment, getting back the traits, and you can see that we have the traits here within our little customer context box. And previously, where you saw like Selena Gomez and shoes, it's using this customer segment where the person's a traveler to now go and get personalized information around travel articles. Okay. Likewise, if we put in another customer ID, in this case, it's a millennial, you can see that all of the content that is being returned from both Cloudinary and from Content Stack reflects kind of the nature of the context, right? So we're personalizing the content based on the context that we're passing in. Okay. And with that, I will hand it back to Dwayne.
Sure thing. All right, so we're going to get really geeky here. This is the stuff that I like. And please look out for the comments to let me know if the font is too small, because I'm trying to not be too large so I can fit everything here. But let's look at what the response looks like of what Jason just did. All right, so Jason just set up, what is it, 3 different components there, 4 different components, and executed it, and that response that happened to, in this case, be a web page, just took that response, the one response, rendered it on a page. So when we think about what this is, like, we're aggregating a response. It called 3 different backend services. It orchestrated that into 2 sets of data points that the UI wanted and rendered for you. So one of the things that you saw that it rendered was a list of headlines or articles, right? So this is what that response actually looks like. Right, here is the response from this was content stack that we pulled these articles from, right? And as a rule of thumb, the components that are used will not modify what the backend default response is. If you want to change or modify the response, that is something that you can subsequently do after you get the data all within the engine, and we'll get to that. So here is the response that came back, right? Those were 3 of the records that were specified in that example of the experience rule that Jason showed you. Also, that came back was the response from Cloudinary. Here's what that response looks like. Right, it gives you the counts, it gives you how long it took to do its work to respond to you. And so this is basically an example of the aggregation work that the engine is doing, just to, here's everything that I did. Now I'm going to give that back to you, the caller of the API. The customer traits to look at here, this actually called segment, and the particular user ID that was fetched had these following traits, and it had a customer type of millennial. You've noticed that each of the component responses that came back has a thing called status. We'll walk through that momentarily. Okay. So now, if we talk about the dependencies now, because that's really what orchestration is, right? It's very easy to go make a call to a back end and just throw it onto a page or kiosk or whatever that client app is going to be. Right, but where the magic really is the dependencies. So let's look at the dependencies here. So, okay, so what we're seeing right here is what the actual configuration of a component looks like. Right. So again, we're not doing coding here. We are configuring an engine. There's a vast difference. There are libraries out there that will give you an SDK to go do the orchestration. That is still coding, right? We want an engine where you configure it, and you should be able to do all of this, within hours, less than a couple of days at most. I say that because when I think Jason had mentioned the omni-channel challenge that we did a few months back. And you can Google that, Conscia 10-day omni-channel challenge. We talk about the effort it took to actually put that whole thing together, where we're calling 3 different backends, orchestrating that for 2 different front ends. And the total work done, to configure the engine was a matter of hours. In net, a couple of days, just to make sure we can choreograph the discussions between the various people that we were talking to. So the work of the configuration is very, very little. So jumping into it, we had, let's focus on 2 of the components that Jason just showed you. There was one that made the call to segment, right? And the component code for that was called customer traits. So if we take a look at how we configure this, right? It's given the name, right? It's given a configuration and a bunch of other things that we're going to go through as we move forward. Okay, but the dependency between the articles or the featured headlines, how did that even happen? How did this component, which is going to content stack, right? How did it know that it needed to first wait for the customer traits component to be executed first? Because remember, the rules for the headlines were based on a customer segment. So how do we know that? So let's walk through that first. The section within every component that you choose to have rules will have this section called component rules. Okay, and within a component rule, you will have one or more sets of rules that will be evaluated at query time. Okay, and what we're saying here is that if the context has a field called customer segment, and the value of that is this traveler, then here is the configuration that I want you to use. So you notice that when these sets of record IDs is what was provided when Jason on that experience rule front end, when he was showing you that you could pick specific records. In the end, all we're doing here is saying, hey, well, here are the record IDs that I want to go fetch from content stack. So this configuration that is specified at a rule level gets merged in to the configuration that is specified at the component level here, right? So here you can, let's just focus on just the stuff that matters here. When you first configure this component, and again, this part is done by tech, right? This is an IT task, is you're going to specify for content stack the content type, whatever the environment is, the connection that would have already been set up. We won't spend time on that. But then, wait a minute, we're not specifying what record IDs do we fetch. Well, we got that from the rule here. It is important to note, though, that if you didn't want or need business user input into this component, you can choose to completely get rid of the component rule section and provide everything needed for this component right within the main configuration itself, right? You could put the record IDs right here, specify that yourself, whatever those IDs are, and then it will go and do that fetching there. Okay, now the fact that there was a rule that was specified and it did relate and it was looking for values in this particular context field called customer segment, well, what the engine knows is that you have already set up another component that actually populates that context field. This is an important part to understand, right? So this is context. There's a context field called customer segment. When you made a call to the engine, you did not specify customer segment. You specified a customer ID, right? And so up here, the customer traits component, its job was to call segment and give it a customer ID and come back with a customer segment. So let's now look at at how that works, right? We basically provided its configuration. It needs the following. So to call segment, you need to give it some kind of an external identifier and the connection, which is your API key and that fun stuff, and then say, please give me back about the traits of the traits of this particular ID that I'm sending you. This is what that configuration looks like. But notice here, the external ID has this expression in it that basically says, I want to get that value at query time from a context field that you pass to me. So when we think about what this means now is that all of the configuration options of every component can either be specified literally at setup time, or more often you're going to be using, you want to get that value from somewhere at query time. In this case, what we're saying here is that we are going to be getting the external ID at query time. We expect there to be a context field called external ID, and I'm going to use that value before executing the customer traits component. Now, last part to set up that dependency is this thing. Now, once the customer trait component runs and it gets a response. Now, what you want to do is take some value from that response and make it available to all of your other components so that they can do more work with it should they choose. We do know that there is a component here that we just looked at called API demo featured headline. So this is the article. And this component has rules that need that customer segment context to be populated. So the engine was smart enough to say, oh, okay, so you're writing rules or looking for some context field called customer segment. And we know that you set up a component that's populating that by this. This is what this means. Context field enrichment means I'm going to enrich the context with this specific value. And this is an object you can actually enrich as many context fields as you want. The data types of those things can be anything valid JSON. Right? We don't put any limitations on that. So just because of that, now we know that there's a dependency that this component has to this first component that's making the call. That's how dependencies work, okay? So it's based on either the rules that look at context fields and or the actual configurations that are right in here that are specified at the component level here, okay? To show an example of what this is that I could choose to do something like this, where I can look at the response of another component, right? So you might have, your data science team may have set up a prediction endpoint that you are using for your own internal customization for your customers. And you want to leverage that, right? So as long as there is a web, like a web service, a way to query that endpoint, we can actually set up a component, a generic web service call component, we'll get into that a little later, to call any of your backend services. And then take that response and let's say you created a component called get prediction, and and you set that up elsewhere. Now I could look at the output of that get prediction and get maybe it returned an object with some other object called recommendation, and then we can do something more with it. The point of this is to show that with very simple expressions, you can now really start to use these Lego blocks to build things that are quite crazy. Because remember, the goal here is that we're trying to make sure that all of the typical types of activities done in any orchestration use case is already done for you here, but with all the available hooks and expressions to be able to tailor it the way that you need to for your specific use case. Expressions allows you to do limitless things now.
Okay, just one quick note on this.
Yeah.
I mean, we're kind of going in the weeds in terms of configuration and all that, but I mean, I wanted to just let folks know on the session that there is a UI as well that basically does everything that Dwayne is kind of mentioning here. On that note, there was another question that I had kind of thrown up and then taken down. So Michael asked, is it possible to retrieve a class of records rather than having specific record IDs? The answer is yes. The example that we showed you was simply what we refer to as a static component, but there is a dynamic component where you basically specify a criteria such as give me any records within the last couple of days or that have a particular tag. So rather than returning specific records, you're returning a set of records that have been dynamically matched. Okay. And I know that we're coming up on kind of the 10-minute mark. We will likely run over. For anyone on this webinar, feel free to, there will be a recording afterwards that will be shared. So if you happen to miss kind of the tail end, feel free to just watch that on your own time once we circulate the link.
Fair enough. Okay, I'm going to go very quickly now. Sorry, guys, this is going over. I'm geeking out way too much here. The next section, let's talk about subcomponents. Okay, so subcomponents is really another way of another type of dependency. So you saw that we had what I just showed you just now is dependency amongst between one component's response and another. But there are many times, very much like in the GraphQL resolverish type of way, you might be returning a list of things, and within each of those things, you need to go and make another call, which is what the GraphQL resolver pattern, to go get more information to enrich that. So you might respond back with an array of objects. It could be movies, and within the movies, you have a list of actor IDs. Now you want to actually call the actor ID component to go get the specifics about those actors and embed them within that particular movie's object. Right? So that is also supported. I will not go and show you that right now because I actually have an example that actually shows that. Just so I can kind of finish toward the end. Hopefully, if there's some time, I can get into the details and show you what that looks like. Okay. The key point with subcomponents and resolvers is that right now we have a GraphQL endpoint that takes advantage of any subcomponents that you may set up. Okay, so what that allows you to do then is actually use a typical GraphQL query and use introspection to be able to see the models the way that you have modeled your components. It actually creates a GraphQL resolver on the fly and all the type definitions, and allows you to query all of this using typical GraphQL endpoint. The real work done though by the engine remains as is. So there's no more coding resolvers. I do know that I have a lot of gray hair. I've been around this for way too long, and so the fat of GraphQL is very, very powerful. It is a way to describe output of a response. It has sometimes been misused to make it seem as though by using GraphQL, oh great, the orchestration is done for me. It's not at all. You need to still do that work by writing what they call resolvers. That's the code, that's the glue, that's the middleware, that's the work that we don't want to ever do anymore. Okay, and so that's why we could do that 10-day challenge and spend only hours of configuration. So we believe that this is going to dramatically reduce time to market with any kind of implementation that has orchestration, and everything has orchestration. Next section, I want to get to some Q&A. Response formatting. So response formatting is, let me see if I can jump to an example here. Response formatting can be done as follows. So here we are looking at an example of a component again, and it is as simple as saying, I already have an example here, response transformation. So you can put in an expression here, and the way that we denote an expression versus just a literal value is by surrounding it with these backtick characters. And then within the expression, you have access to like it's a full JavaScript expression, and it has access to certain libraries like Ramda, Lodash, Luxon, various utility functions to help you write these expressions. And so here, what we're doing is taking the array of articles that came back from Content Stack, and we can access the component response with the variable called response, and then choose to pick out or to keep only the properties author, content, and description. That's one way to do the transformation. We also have very specific components themselves that you can feed a configuration into, take the output of another component, and do the reformatting there. And lastly, and I'll make this the only part I'll talk about as far as the webhook, so because it's a viable example to use here. Maybe you want to actually take the output of this particular component and call your own custom logic because you need to do something that's highly customized, right? Then you can expose that, put that in a serverless function, or put that somewhere where we can pass you this response. So this is a webhook that you can put in place right here, and then say, I'm going to call this external web service that was given to me by the IT person, and it expects you to return the object that was like the modified or updated object. So that again, we have many places within the lifecycle of a request that allows you to inject your own custom logic. Conditional execution. So conditional execution is as follows. I'm just going to look at this particular picture here. Every component will get processed. Every single component that you've defined will, and queried and asked for is going to go through a phase of being processed, right? And what it will do is start to wait to make sure that all of its, for every component, it'll make sure that all of its dependencies are met or run first. And then once they're run, it will start to execute. And then you can then choose via further expressions to say, do we consider the response that came back from this backend service to be valid? By default, it's valid. You can choose to put in another expression to say, should, if the response didn't contain a certain property or whatever the expression is, then I want you to deem this as invalid. It will go to a failed state if the call itself to the backend service actually failed, right? And then you can choose to say, to also put in different logic to say, when should I even be making this call? Should I even be triggered at all? Now you can choose to call some other service to say, is now the right time to make this call? Yes or no. By default, it will always be true. I'm going to try to make that call, but you can put in an expression to say, here's the only condition that here's the condition that should be met before I make this call. What this allows you to do is to have any possible conditional logic and chain them such that you're doing a set of, if this happens, then that. If that doesn't happen, then I shouldn't do this. This allows you to chain very potentially complicated pieces of logic in a very easy and readable tree-like structure to be able to understand all of this. Okay, and we actually have a roadmap item to actually spit out all of the configurations of all the components to you in a visual way so that you can now pretty much self-document itself, which is key, because now all that logic is no longer embedded into code that someone left and went on vacation for and then forgot how it works. Okay, and caching, I think we have talked about. With caching, you can choose to say at a component level, here are the things that I need to cache. You can then say, here's how long I want to cache it for. In number of seconds, it can be number of days. You can choose to keep the cache for as long as you want. And then there's, again, if you choose to be more specific about when you want to cache, you can do that as well. Maybe you only want to cache when a certain condition is met, or when the response only looks a certain way. You have that ability as well. Last part before I turn it back over to Jason and we do some Q&A, because I am rushing now. So I want to make sure that you guys kind of get the breadth of what the engine is capable of doing. Asynchronous component execution is not something that people think about a lot, but it is actually very, 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 very important. You might choose to configure a bunch of components. Let me go back to the screen and go back to the picture that we saw in the beginning here. All right, here's a bunch of components doing a bunch of work to call some backend services. Let's say that you have another component here that you wish to actually take some part of the response from one of these components, and you want to log it somewhere. Because remember, the example that we're talking about right now has been querying and reading things. But remember that we're just choreographing and orchestrating a bunch of web service calls, right? So many times you're going to want to write things to somewhere. So if that somewhere is going to be something that could potentially be very slow, if you're going to be logging something, and let's say the thing that you're logging is it takes a second to come back. Well, that is not, you don't want to hold up the response of this, or hold up the response to the caller until all of the components are done. So you can actually mark certain components, any number of them, as asynchronous, true or false. And if it's true, then what the engine will do, every time components are actually executed and they're valid and they're ready to be returned, even if there's outstanding components left, if those outstanding components left the process are marked as asynchronous, it's not going to wait. It's going to respond to you right away with the components that we know that you're waiting on right now, and it will sit and then ensure that the components that were marked as asynchronous will get called later on, but you still get your response back ASAP. As far as observability, sorry, Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, no, so just to jump in, I know we have a couple of additional topics to cover. We also have a long list of questions that people have submitted, so thank you.
Let's jump in.
What we'll do, Dwayne, is continue with the planned topics. Kind of take your time, and then once that's done, then we'll go through the list of questions that have been submitted so far.
This will be the last one, I promise, said the techie guy who just keeps talking and talking. The last part is the observability and the telemetry of the engine. So we're logging everything that's going through this engine. We know when every component was called. We know what its status was. We know if it passed or it failed, who made the query and from where, right? So we hold on to all of that information. So we then allow you to, should you choose to want to put this into some other system of your own to do some BI and analysis on, what's my average wait time of calling segment, or how long in total is the DX engine taking to respond. Like, all of those details are all logged and available to you in bulk. We have a roadmap item to also be able to do our own dashboards to kind of make that easy for you to consume and see how things are going at that level. So all that to say that those asynchronous components that would have run, there is still a log of what came back later, right? Because obviously, just because something is marked as asynchronous, you may still want to know, well, did it succeed? What happened? How long did it take? So we hold on to all of that information for you. I'm going to stop talking now and hand it back to you, Jason, and we can start to go through some Q&A.
Okay. I'll open it up to Oasis first. I mean, anything that you want to cover, Oasis, or should we just jump straight to the questions?
No, I think we covered everything. Well, Dwayne covered everything very well,
Yeah.
so we can just jump into the Q&A.
That's Oasis's friendly way of saying Dwayne speaks too much.
All right, so we'll go through the list of questions. I mean, I think some of them we've spoken to, but I'll just bring them up anyways. So, Nikolai has asked, what happens if an API takes too long to respond?
Right. We never showed this, but there's actually a timeout. So at a component level, you can choose a number of, it's not second, it's milliseconds to actually wait. And if it doesn't wait, then the status will turn into failed. So that's how we force it to not sit there and wait indefinitely or wait for some default 30-second timeout.
Okay, and just as a follow-up to that, I mean, if you're talking about orchestrating services consisting of a number of APIs, is the latency kind of associated to the slowest part of that?
So that assumes that you, so the answer would be yes, if all three of them could be run in a row, assuming that there's no interdependencies amongst them, right? So assuming that there wasn't any, that means the engine is going to try to run them all immediately. It also assumes that none of those components that you clicked on cached, because if it's cached, then maybe what would have been the slowest is now the fastest because you had already made that call with those particular configurations for that component earlier, and that response is already there. But generally speaking, yes, it would be the slowest.
Okay, I'm just looking for some other questions. Okay, so here's a question from David around the implications of using kind of a front-end builder such as builder.io.
If using builder.io or Vue Storefront. The Vue Storefront connecting to Contentful, for example, would they need to completely rewrite the connections between both?
Yeah, so I can take a stab at this one without getting into the technical detail. So we do have a connector with builder.io, and we are working on one for the Vue Storefront. So hopefully that answers your question, David.
Yeah, to add on to that, like once if the existing connector has been set up for to query the backend system directly, the only difference would be to swap it out with the Conscia connector, but the configurations that you've likely put into the backend connector would now just need to be put into the Conscia connection, and none of the other workflows need to change.
On the topic of kind of cache invalidation, so if there's kind of a dependency of components, does invalidating the cache kind of trigger a cascading effect to invalidate the other ones?
That's actually an option that we're about to push. I get what you're saying. That's a very, very good question. So there's one thing to be able to specify a cache at a component level. If component B depends on component A, and we're caching component B, and we're caching component A, what do we do? Right? We're going to be giving two options. The option that's there right now is that it's going to use component A's cache. So the dependencies, the dependent component will just use whatever was cached. But you'll have the option of saying, if there's a dependency on me, and that cache has invalidated, then I should invalidate mine as well. So that's there. So that's a very good point.
Okay. We've got a question from Andrew saying, what if you have some sort of legacy system that is not, part of the fancy kind of mock architecture?
Good question. So to us, the architecture of the thing we're calling, we really don't, it doesn't matter, right? Because we are orchestrating web service calls at the end of the day. So if the web service, like we're calling a web service, we're getting a response back, and then we're going to orchestrate it with a bunch of other calls. Do we know the architecture used by the platform that responded to that web service call? We have no idea, right? So no, that's my long-winded way of saying no. It doesn't really matter what the implementation approach was for the thing that responded with the to the web service call. Good question, though.
Okay. And so David had asked an earlier question around kind of the front ends, Builder.io and View Storefront. There's a follow-up question in terms of how would that change the experience for contributors? Would Conscia be the only source for it? He was kind of looking for an answer because he's very technical and kind of looking at the entire journey for customers.
So sorry, I wish I had him on a call so I could ask some more clarifying questions here. So I guess what he's getting at is you have set up View Storefront or Builder.io. You've done the work to do the integrations with some backend services, and you'll want to bring Conscia in. So I'll talk to it a bit, and hopefully it touches on what you're getting at. But for the parts of the page, first of all, you're talking about a web page now, so I'll use that as an example. But not all parts of the web page need to be powered by this orchestration engine, right? You're only going to want to call the DX engine for things that you want to orchestrate. So parts of the page, can continue to be rendered by the calls that were already there in the beginning, and you can make a slow migration over toward making more parts of, in this case, the web page, just calling the one endpoint against the DX engine and start to put that logic inside the engine. And all that to say is that while the DX engine is really now acting as this kind of brain in the middle of all this thing, by putting it there too, we are making ourselves as well composable, right? Like the whole goal of composable is that it should be that any of these pieces in theory should be standalone and replaceable, basically end up being compostable, right? And so our goal here is to make it very, very clear. Here is the logic. If you choose to write this logic in some other way, or there's some other orchestration as a service engine comes along, then it's very easy to understand what that logic is within the Conscia DX engine and swap that out. Obviously, we hope you won't, because we're just so darn good. But that is what the goal of composable is, right? So we want to encapsulate that logic in there. So David, I know that what you're getting at is that you might have already done a lot of integration work, and it's now kind of really built into the pages, right? And our goal is to be able to slowly move you into a way of taking that logic out and centralizing it so that it can be used across not just web, across any channel at all. I hope that answers your
from a UI developer perspective as well, like let's say you've built out custom components that you're using in your builder.io application. Usually, like the assumption is these custom components are translating some kind of data from a backend system into some kind of UI. Now, the thing is, because Conscia's components by default preserve the exact payload that's coming from these backend systems. Essentially, in as far as the UI components are concerned, they don't really have to change because all that has to change is where in the say the builder data binding you are mapping from. But essentially, since the structure remains the same, it's very close to a drop-in replacement.
Right. How do I QA and debug these nested mappings? Very good question. So because I had to rush through this, I'll just describe it to you. I did have a response that actually showed you the debug. So when you make a request to the engine, by default, it shows you it responds with an object, and every key of the object is the response that came back. When you can choose to make that call with debug equals true. And with debug equals true, for every component, it gives you back another debug section that shows you everything that the component went through. So for example, if in the component you chose to have rules, right, that need to be evaluated, it will show you which rule actually got selected. If you chose to use the component to enrich the context, to make up to create dependencies between those things. I don't know if you remember when we talked about that part, then it will show you that when it ran, this is the context field that it enriched with the value that it enriched it with. Because remember, you're evaluating expressions sometimes on the fly. So you're going to want to see, well, what did this expression evaluate to? So during development, you're always going to be running this with debug equals true to see all of the work that every component is doing, because that's really going to be the only way that you know that you're getting back what you expected to get back from the output of another component, from the output of a backend service, or from an expression that you're writing as part of the configuration. It gives you an enormous amount of a gross amount of detail to do all that.
And from the testing side of things, I also want to point out that we provide preview environments as well. So every DX Engine customer has a preview environment, which is sort of like a testing sandbox that you can use to first try out new changes, test them, and then migrate them to the live environment.
Good point. Yeah. Yes.
So we're just kind of watching all the comments kind of float in here. Thank you for all the positive feedback that everybody has shared. Oasis and Dwayne, any kind of closing statements that you want to make before we kind of wrap this up?
I have a closing statement about the roadmap. So we'll publish this soon. One of the things I mentioned during the call was exposing the GraphQL endpoint to the world. We're just kind of putting the finishing touches onto the documentation of the GraphQL endpoint. So while it's there, nothing is really there until it's well documented, as you know, right? So that's coming. There's going to be a GitHub action. So for the folks out there that love GitOps as much as we do, especially that Oasis guy, as you can see, the entire engine is actually configured by JSON, right? And so what we're going to be doing is having a GitHub action that allows you to actually do the configuration from a Git push publish, right? So you can actually build and pull from your own configuration that you can store in JSON, and then it will actually publish itself to the DX engine. So that'll be really cool. We have we're going to have a community set of reformatters for various backends. So part of being compostable, it's an awful word, but that's what's been used. So part of being compostable is the ability to be able to swap between backends, right? And so you're going to want to come up with some kind of a standard vocabulary of the way objects are structured, right? So because we can actually write very simple or complicated expressions or call webhooks to reformat things, that allows the users in the community at large to be able to write a set of component or write a set of reformatters to make the backends more uniform and structured, so that I can now swap this out with that, and the structure doesn't change or changes very little. So we're going to come out with that, and then finally an on-premise agent. So what that means is that right now the engine is out in the cloud, it's running, and it is obviously orchestrating calls to web services that it can see. If you're a customer, or you have a customer who has a system behind the firewall, way too much work to expose that externally, what do we do? Because they want to orchestrate something from there. They want to get their real-time inventory from there, right? How do you do that? Right? So what's coming is an agent that runs in their world that can be locked down, obviously, the way that they need to lock it down, because obviously they're not going to allow inbound traffic. But the agent actually connects in a peer-to-peer like structure. I won't get into the details, but it connects outward to the mothership. And now it essentially is part of that engine now. So the engine can now funnel calls to services that are behind the firewall. And obviously, security-minded folks are going to be like, well, we're going to need to be able to lock that down, right? Well, absolutely. So you're going to be able to, let's say, make a call to your internal Oracle, Postgres, MySQL, whatever database, let's say, internally. But of course, you're going to be locking down the ports to ensure that that agent is doing something that it shouldn't do. So that's a little eye on the roadmap. We will post that as well and keep you guys up to date. Please follow us so that it'll get to you when we actually post all that stuff.
Anything from your side, Moises?
No, I think Dwayne covered everything.
Okay, so thank you everybody for kind of teching out with us. And as Dwayne mentioned, follow us on LinkedIn. You will get notifications of our next seminar, and feel free to reach out to us as well if you have any questions that we weren't able to cover. Hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.